So, you want to make real bread, but you don't have a mixer. No problem. Today we are learning to knead wet dough by hand. I'll be making my focaccia dough from last week's video, linked below, but you can apply this technique to any bread dough. Place the dry ingredients into a large wide bowl. I prefer light stainless steel bowls because they're easy to rotate. Whisk them together. In another bowl, whisk together your wet ingredients. Make a big well in the dry ingredients. We have a lot of liquid here. Don't do this on the counter. If you misjudge how big of a well you need, the liquid will escape and run right off your counter and onto the floor, which won't be fun to clean up. Grab a fork and start mixing. Concentrate on keeping your wet stuff in the center and adding the flour to it very gradually. We want to get a lot of mixing done before we run out of flour. This will be a very sticky dough. 70% hydration for the folks familiar with baker's percentages. And we want to develop at least some gluten before we run out of flour. Whisk with one hand, slowly adding tiny bits of flour from the walls of your well while rotating the bowl with the other hand. When your dough looks something like this, it's more efficient to start folding it over, kind of like kneading instead of whisking. See how I'm folding it toward the center and rotating the bowl after every fold. When the dough gets too stiff for a fork, flour your hand, clean off the fork, and continue with your hands. Remember to keep one hand clean so that you can rotate the bowl after every fold. Also, try to minimize your contact with the dough. Handle it like a hot potato. If you hold it for a second too long, it will stick to you. Don't change the direction of rotation. The goal is to wrap the dough around itself. If you start to stick, scrape off your hand and sprinkle it with flour from the bowl. By the way, the part of my hand that presses into the dough is the back of the palm. I know you just want to quickly incorporate all this flour and get a dough, but don't rush this step. If you develop some gluten at this stage, the dough will want to stick to itself more than you, and you won't be in such a sticky situation later on. Okay, all the flour is in and it's time to go onto the counter where the real kneading starts. I suggest you set a timer for 10 minutes starting at this stage. Beginner bakers often underestimate how much kneading a dough needs. After 2 minutes, they think they've been kneading for 20 and quit, which is unfortunate because that's how you get dense, yucky bread. Have a pastry scraper handy to get you out of sticky situations. And repeat after me. I solemnly swear to avoid the temptation of adding more flour. Sorry though, this flour is for my hands, not for you. You're going to pick up the dough with your fingers underneath and your thumbs on top. Flip it over, giving it a good whack, and fold it over away from you. Now pick it up from this side, flip, whack, fold. Yes, you'll be stuck in the dough. Don't fight it, just go with it. Let's do it slowly. Pick up from the side, flip, whack, fold away from you. Picking up the dough from the side gives you a 90-degree rotation on each fold. The whack is not just stress relieving, this aggressive beating of the dough develops gluten faster. Once you develop enough gluten, the dough won't stick to your counter nearly as much. If you left a chunk on the counter after you whack and fold, just hit that spot a few times and the dough will eventually pick up whatever it lost on the previous fold. If all else fails, there is always the pastry scraper. I learned this method under the name of French fold. I'm sure that's not its name in France. Maybe in France it's just called kneading. If you know, leave me a comment. It's been about 8 minutes since I got the dough out of the bowl. See how smooth it became? At this stage, I could even knead it using the method I showed you in the bowl. Fold towards you, quick press, and rotate. If you use this method, make sure you keep your fingertips up. Don't grab the dough underneath so that you don't rip it. Fingers up and don't press down longer than a split second. There are many ways to knead, and eventually you'll develop your own style, but it's important to keep folding and rotating the dough in the same direction. Kneading is not just mushing, it's training your dough to become more flexible by stretching it. Into an oiled bowl we go. Hey you, let go! Pastry scraper is man's best friend. And we are ready to rise. Here are some frequently asked questions about kneading by hand. Why can't I add flour while kneading? The more flour you add, the fewer holes you'll get. And if you don't want any holes, are you sure bread baking is the right hobby? I'm just kidding, there are dense bread styles too. Of course, never say never. Sure, there are cases where little flour is needed. Maybe your humidity is a lot higher than mine, or maybe you are working with a wetter dough, but it's important to try to reduce stickiness through aggressive dough workout before you reach for flour. Try the French fold method for 3 minutes. If your dough is still too wet, try a little flour. What's a good hydration level for beginners? 70% is a good dough to practice on. In other words, the water weight is 70% of the flour weight. Once you're comfortable with it, you can move on to wetter doughs. But I also find that there is no need to work with a soup if you learn good kneading technique. Developing a very strong gluten network can produce spectacular holes even with 70% hydration. If you have no idea what I'm talking about with all these percentages, watch my basic focaccia video linked below. Can autolyzing help? Autolyze or autolyse, depending on whether you like the English or French pronunciation better, is the technique of resting the dough before kneading it. After the dough comes together, cover the dough with plastic and let it sit in the bowl for 30 minutes. Letting the dough hydrate before kneading will result in easier gluten development. The reason I rarely do it is inconvenience. I don't mind getting up to my elbow in dough, but I prefer to get it done so that I can move on with my day. Should I knead by hand if I have a mixer? There are no bread quality benefits to kneading by hand, but there are educational benefits. Judging when you've kneaded enough is extremely hard for beginner bakers. When you're kneading by hand, you'll actually feel the dough transform. You can't just follow the recipe without being 100% mindful of what's happening. Some people also find kneading by hand relaxing and therapeutic. When I started learning about bread, I kneaded by hand, but now I knead in a mixer. Can I over-knead my dough? You can't over-knead bread dough by hand. When in doubt, knead some more. The only time you really need to worry about over-kneading is if you are using a mixer with a spiral dough hook. Can I use this technique for enriched breads like brioche? You can certainly use this technique for doughs that contain eggs and butter, but I would not recommend making a full-fat brioche without a mixer. The problem there is not the wetness of the dough, but the warmth of your hands melting the butter. If you don't have a mixer and want brioche-like bread, I'll link to my milk bread dough in the description below. You can easily knead it by hand and it's absolutely delicious. Here are more thought-provoking culinary videos for you to check out, and if you are ever in the Boston area, maybe I'll see you in one of my classes.